Okay, thank you everyone for joining this morning or this afternoon or evening, wherever you're joining from. My name is Eunice Rhee from Seattle University, and my co-host Vivian Guo from CEIVS is also here. And today I want to welcome you to this great virtual writing event, especially with our very distinguished speaker, Tim Pollock here. It's a great honor to have him join us today. I don't think he's running to grab something. I don't think he needs a great introduction because many of you are already familiar with his work and his great papers. But today he'll be talking about the importance of storytelling in academic writing. Especially, he's going to walk us through how to work on different elements of storytelling so that we can all have a better writing practice and improve our academic writing. The way we're going to proceed today is Tim is going to take the stage so that he'll be talking about the importance of storytelling in academic writing. And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to enter them in the chat room. We'll be monitoring the chat room for the Q&A session. So we'll plan to go about 30 to 40 minutes and then move on to Q&A. So whatever question you have about academic writing and how to apply storytelling to your academic writing, please feel free to ask all the questions you have about academic writing. And after that, we'll take a quick break and move on to our writing part. So it's going to be more about quiet co-working. So if you have any writing projects that you're working on, you can use that time to make any kind of progress on your own writing. So that is how we're going to proceed today. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing so that Tim can start sharing his screen. So welcome again, everyone, and we'll have a great time together today.
Hey folks, let me get the screen up here. Sorry, I had to run away from the screen there right away. My dog chose the time to start barking at the FedEx guy right as we were doing the introduction, so I wanted to go close the front door. The joys of working at home, right? So I'm thrilled to be here today. I'm just kind of adjusting your heads on my monitor here. So I'm very excited to be here today. I think this is a fantastic event and activity that Eunice and Vivian have been organizing and that you all get to do each month. And I'm really pleased to be able to participate and be a presenter for you. So as you may or may not know, I've recently published a book, How to Use Storytelling in Your Academic Writing. And Eunice asked me if I would talk about some of the topics from that book today. And so this month, I guess I should say, we're focusing on the structure of storytelling and some storytelling techniques that you can employ in writing academic articles. So what we do as academics, I like to always start talking about this a little bit. I think we have a really cool job because our job is to think up interesting unanswered questions, figure out how to answer them, test them, find out the answers, and then tell the story. And our focus as academics is not just on description, but on answering questions. Why does something happen? And I think that in general, we spend far too little time thinking about and crafting the story part of our studies. We spend so much time on the coming up with the question and the testing of it. And we don't think about how we're going to tell the story because data does not speak for itself. We have to frame and help people interpret and understand what it is that we found and present this information, both the question and the answers, in an engaging way. And so that's why storytelling, I think, is a really important part of what we do as academics. I completely reject the idea that what we write are research reports because a report is simply a dry recitation of information and does not provide the benefits that storytelling does, because storytelling, like a report, delivers information. But more than that, it conveys experiences and inspires action and it entertains. And these last 2 points in particular are things that we want to do because as academics, because we want people to actually take actions based upon what we find, whether that's building upon and citing our work or having more of a practical impact on the world. And to the extent we can entertain people and engage them as part of this process, they're gonna pay more attention to what we're saying, and our ideas are gonna be more likely to stick in their minds, and they'll be willing to build on them. And that has a number of benefits for us as well as academics. First, it allows you to frame how others interpret your work. Like I said, data doesn't speak for itself, and so you want to make sure people interpret and understand your findings and your questions in the way that you intend. An effective story helps you do that. Good storytelling and good writing in general also, in my experience, help lead to greater publishing success. I've seen papers with good ideas that are so badly written, or the story so ineffectively told, that the good ideas just never get see the light of day or get published. And so that the ability to tell an effective story is more likely to get your paper in front of people, and thus it's also likely to have greater influence, lead your work to be cited more regularly, more likely to become a home run paper, those sorts of things. And being a good storyteller and a good writer also makes you more attractive as a co-author. So it's a leverageable skill that people will want to work with you if they know that you are really good at writing, because in my experience in our field, this is the rarer skill to have. So if you can cultivate it and develop it, you're going to be more effective and you're going to be in demand. People are going to want to work with you, which increases your opportunities to work on better projects and more interesting projects, and have all these other benefits as well. So there's a lot of upsides to being a good storyteller and think about what you're writing as storytelling. So there are many different ways to think about, or the structure of a story. I like to use Freytags Pyramid. Before we get to the pyramid, though, Aristotle talked about a drama, that at the core of a drama is a knot, that some problem or issue that the protagonist has to resolve. And so when we think about writing a story, what we're doing is in a drama we first are tying the knot, creating that tension, identifying the challenges that the protagonist has to overcome, and then we're untying or unraveling the knot and resolving it, so that we see whether or not the protagonist succeeds or fails, what the outcome was. And so I like to think about writing a story and writing an academic paper as about the process of tying and untying a knot. And Gustav Freytag, who was a 19th century drama theorist, he took the five components of the 5 acts of the traditional 5-act play, which have been around for thousands of years, and overlaid them on this pyramidal structure, and argued that this is an effective way to think about the structure of a 5-act play. So the first act is the exposition. So the exposition is where you provide the background. So it describes the world as it currently is, but also kind of sets the seeds of the conflict that's going to come in your story. So this is where you introduce characters, you describe the current situation, the world as it is, provide backstories, describe events that have occurred before your story begins. So all the exposition is in the front. Sometimes we use exposition along the way in particularly in the rising action, to introduce new characters and set up some complications. But most of the exposition tends to be front-loaded in the first act of the play. The second, went the wrong way. The second act is the rising action. So this is where some conflict or complications or challenges that our protagonist faces are introduced, and it's also where the potential for the protagonist to overcome these challenges is also suggested at. So this is where the tension occurs. This is where the setbacks and the challenges that our protagonists face are introduced, and the tension in your story is built. The climax is, unlike the rest of the pyramid, is a point rather than a segment, right? So it's relatively short. This is the period of highest tension. It's basically where the rising action stops, where your knot is fully tied, and it's where we now shift to the falling action and the unraveling of the knot. And the falling action is where the outcome of the story is revealed. The tension is resolved. The protagonist either succeeds or fails. And by the end of the falling action, we know the outcome. We know what's happened. We've got all the answers. And then the denouement is the final act of the play. This is where where you are now, you have the moment of catharsis for the audience, where things are put to rights, where sense is made of all the information that we've seen, and the ground is also perhaps laid for our protagonists' next adventure, and is set up for the future. And so, and I argue that this is a really useful way of thinking about overlaying this structure on an academic article. And as we think about how we write our papers and what goes in each part of it, if we think about them as a story following this 5-act structure. So let me give you a couple illustrations. So so for a quantitative article, overlaying this on the traditional article structure, I'd suggest that the exposition is where it involves the introduction and the theory development section of a paper. So this is where we're laying the background, what prior research has found. We're introducing our key constructs, who are characters that we're going to be following throughout the story, what we know, but also where some problems lie with the current environment, the way things currently are. And this can extend into the beginning of the theory development section, depending upon how you write your paper, because you may continue to define key constructs and provide expositional information in that very beginning part of your theoretical background, hypothesis development, lit review, however you want to think about it, or how you structure your paper. The rising action is where we develop our hypotheses and we introduce our methods, because these are the challenges that we face, right? So what we're doing is we're setting up and saying, here are the questions, here are the challenges, here's what research hasn't found, and here's how we think it could be resolved. So we're setting up the possibility of what the solutions might be. And then our methods section continues this, because we're showing, okay, here's how we're going to go about testing this. And we're tying the knot a little bit further, because some of the questions may be, well, how are you going to measure that? How are you going to structure that? What kind of analysis are you going to be able to do to be able to unravel the knot that you are tying? And by the beginning of the results, I argue that's typically the climax. So the knot's fully tied at the end of the methods section, and now we're going to get to the solutions. So so your results section, where you're doing your hypothesis tests, conducting post hoc analyses and robustness tests, this is the following action. We're testing our hypotheses. We're figuring out, okay, what do we know? What don't we know? There can still be moments of tension in the following action and surprises. And that's where the post hoc analyses and the robustness tests oftentimes come in, because we may find things that are surprising. Our hypotheses aren't supported, or things work in an opposite direction. Or when we do a particular post hoc analysis, something that wasn't supported in the main analysis, we find some interesting or additional result, right? That can add nuance to our story. But by the end of our results section, we know all of our results. And then our discussion is our denouement. This is where we now make sense of what have we found. We pull all of our findings together. We tie it back to the existing literature, talk about extensions and implications, and talk our limitations, of course, but also our future research directions, and which are the challenges that our characters might be facing next in their new adventures. So I think it overlays on the structure actually pretty well. It applies equally, I think I would argue, to qualitative and theoretical papers too. So for qualitative, if you're a qualitative researcher, the introduction and the theoretical background section that typically follows your introduction are often are part of the exposition. As you develop your theoretical background and introduce some of the complications of the existing literature and describe your context and methods, this again is the rising action. The beginning of your findings section then is the climax. That's where the knot's fully tied at that point, and we're going to start to unravel the knot. And your findings and perhaps the beginning of your discussion, depending upon where you kind of fully unravel your model and kind of put it all together, whether you have that final description at the end of your findings or the beginning of your discussion, that's the following action. But once your complete model that you've inducted, or theory that you've inducted, or findings are completely revealed, then the remainder of the discussion again is the denouement. So in a theory article, it's a little bit different, because there's no data, right? There's no empirical part of it to discuss. So the introduction and the beginning of the theoretical background again can be part of the exposition. And the theoretical background of problem development, as we set up what we're going to be doing, if we're developing a typology or developing a theoretical model or a process model, whatever you're doing in your paper, that setup for that is actually the rising action in this paper, and what we would think of perhaps as the Rising action in a quantitative paper where we're developing our theory and our hypotheses. If you're doing propositions in your theory paper, this would be it. But the theoretical deliverable then is a falling action, because you set up the problem, and in a theory paper, the delivery, the payoff is the theoretical model that you're developing. So that becomes the falling action. And then the discussion section is again the denouement. So, and I've drawn these all the triangles, all the pyramids look the same, but when I discuss, I have another chapter in my book where I discuss what's different about the qualitative and theory papers in the book. After I discuss the structure, the different segments of an article, these are different, right? So you may have a shorter or longer discussions, denouement or exposition. The rising action may be relatively short and steep in this case, and a much longer falling action. In other papers, you may have a really big payoff and then a fall. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So, the structure, this 5-act play, can be applied to any, I would argue, to any type of paper that academics write. So along with this, is important to think about who your characters are. So if you're writing a story, our stories are about characters, and we have to know who our protagonists or our main characters are, who the supporting characters are, etc. And when you're writing a paper, your characters are not the firms or the contextual actors or the people that you're talking about. They're your theoretical constructs. So you need to think of the theoretical constructs as the characters in your story. And you have to identify first your main characters, and the main characters are who the story's about. They're the ones taking the journey. They're the focus. And they could, depending upon the nature of your story, they could be only IVs, only independent variables. So it might be about the relationship among two independent variables, and the DV is a little bit more incidental in your study. It could be about the DVs only. What you're really interested in is the dependent variable, what it is you're trying to predict, and the independent variables are just means to understanding the DV in more detail. Or it could be both the IVs and DVs. You may be, the relationship between them may be the key focus of your story. So, but it's understanding which of these are your main characters. You also have to identify your supporting characters. So these are people who are actors who, in our case, constructs who play a significant role, but it's not about them. They're there to support and help and tell part of the story, but they're not the focal characters. They're not developed quite as fully as the independent variables or the main characters. And oftentimes they play a moderator or mediator role. So they show up for part of the story, but they're not there for the whole story. And then finally, we have the ensemble, the background, the chorus. These are the characters that help fill out the story, but they play small roles. And I tend to think of them in our models as our control variables. They help fill out the story, fill out the context, but they're not the key focus. So they're in the background. There are extras, but they're not the focus of our story. It's also hard to talk about a story without talking about themes and storylines. So and that theoretical construct shouldn't be up there, so I'm not sure why it is. The theme is what your story is about. In our case, it's typically your research question. Everything you write should somehow relate to your theme. So I like Marvel movies, superhero movies, and Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I think they've actually done a really good job over multiple films, having a key theme or story that they've carried throughout the multiple films, especially the Avengers series, and the way they've built and layered in the different characters and the different storylines, but they all support this central theme about trying to stop Thanos from killing half of all living creatures in the universe. The storylines are the specific path that each character takes. So they're related, more character related, and the storyline should help support and drive the theme. And you may find that your characters have separate paths, and they may follow separate paths in the story, but at some point these have to intersect and relate to the theme. So in the Marvel universe, Iron Man, Captain America, Black Widow, the Hulk, all these different folks, they had their own storylines and their own themes. They were separate sometimes, but they also came together and co-joined, at least for part of the journey. So they and worked together to help tell the whole story. you may find that sometimes their paths by the end of the story split and they follow different paths moving forward. But one of the tricks is not to introduce too many storylines, because that can bog down your story and make it too difficult to understand. So with every character, if you're introducing a new theory, you're probably going to end up with too many storylines in your paper. And so you want to manage the number of storylines so that readers can keep track of them as well. So avoid this introducing too many storylines. So quick question, and you can unmute and say, please, if you know, does anybody know what this photo is and what it represents? Does anybody recognize this? This is a very famous, iconic image. So we want to take a shot at it? Okay, so this image helped launch, or was primarily responsible for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the U.S. It was taken during peaceful protests in Birmingham, Alabama, protesting racism and Jim Crow in the South in the U.S. And a photographer for the New York Times snapped this picture, and it appeared above the fold on the New York Times. And the reason it was so influential was because this photo really put a human face on the civil rights problems that were going on in the South for Northerners. For most of them, they've been hearing about this for years, but it was really abstract. They didn't have a sense of what this actually looked like. And this photo put that face on it. It brought in the emotion. You could see, this young African-American man trying to march, and with the cops attacking them with German shepherds, with police dogs, while he's just trying to protest peacefully. And that really, crystallized for people and brought the emotion to the abstract ideas. And that's what we want to try to do with the human face. So now we're moving from structure to techniques. And adding a human face to your work is one of the techniques that we can use to make our paper more engaging, because the human face adds an emotional element to the story and gives people something they can relate to, and helps makes our abstract stories more concrete, because it allows our readers to connect with your story. And so one of the things I argue and encourage you to do is think about how can you add a human face to your research. So it brings the emotional component, brings the logical facts to life. So some ways you can do this are draw a picture of people that others recognize. And so we have different ways we can do this, using quotes or dialogue, especially quotes that have their everyday language involved, that allow people to hear somebody speaking in a way that they recognize or understand. Describing body language, clenched fists, furrowed brows, these sorts of descriptions help draw a more vivid picture of your characters. Describing concrete actions that they take can all be powerful ways of drawing a human face. It's also important to show actors acting. So we need to have examples that provide descriptions. So you can describe your own experience. So something that has happened to you, and an experience you've had. You can interview people about their experiences and include quotes and descriptions of their experiences. This is in qualitative research. This is a lot of what we do, particularly in findings sections, where we're using quotes and examples to help induct our theory, but these make them more engaging and readable. You can use stories or examples from the news, from newspapers. You can even develop fictional accounts, which are called scenarios, although I encourage you to be clear that this is a fictional account when you do it, and don't present a fictional story as a real event. And finally, a way that I think is underused but is really influential is to use rhetorical questions, because that way you can put the reader's own face on your story. Because if you ask a rhetorical question, when they think about their answer to that question, it's going to be based upon their lived experience. And so it makes it more realistic for them. And so the human face in the story becomes their own human face. And you don't have to come up with an example they might not understand, because your question elicits an example that's going to be relevant to them. So another technique besides putting a human face on your paper that really enhances your storytelling is managing motion and pacing. So motion and pacing are a combination of action and commentary that you combine to create these. So action moves the story forward and creates a sense of motion, and pacing is the rate at which the story unfolds. So if your pacing is too quick, then the paper is going to be too choppy and abrupt. It's going to feel like a forced march. If your pacing's too slow, it's going to be more of a slog. So look at these two paintings. My wife painted the one on the left, and a good friend of ours painted the one on the right. Which painting has more motion and energy to you? One on the left, right? Yeah. So yeah, everybody's pointing the other way from me because your screens are in the opposite direction. But yeah, the one on the left, and the name of that painting is actually Charge. That was the name of the piece. But having that kind of energy, they're both beautiful. But you want your article to be more like the one on the left, where you have some motion and energy and action, as opposed to a still life where nothing's moving. So what are some types of action that we can introduce, and ways we can introduce action? One form of action is natural action. So these are the actions we expect to see in a situation, describing things you would expect to see in a particular situation. But action can also be hidden or future actions. So these are the actions that we can't see or that haven't happened yet, that are coming, that we can allude to. So social dynamics, cognitive processes would be examples of particular hidden actions. We can't see a cognitive process, but it is an action that's going on that we can describe. Mental actions create shifts by introducing new ideas. So as you bring a new idea into your paper, that moves the paper along. So you've described one idea, you've developed one hypothesis, and now we move to the next. That's introducing a new idea to your paper. And the rate at which these unfold and how quickly you introduce your mental action, these different mental actions, can affect the pacing of your paper. You can also have made up actions. These are actions that are described using similes and metaphors. So the terminology and the language that we use can help lead us to different kinds of actions. And there are also different ways to create motion. One of them is to use what are called turbo verbs. So a turbo verb. So instead of saying a group stopped meeting, we can say a group dissolved or disintegrated. So that's a more active, more powerful type of verb than ended. To and fro refers to the moving in your language from general to specific and back, or from abstract and concrete to back. So, but having this movement back and forth to different types of and levels of specificity and types of language can also create a sense of motion within your paper. Varying sentence and paragraph length is another way in which I think is crucial. So having a mix of short and long sentences, as well as short and long paragraphs. If you look at a page and it's a single paragraph page and it just keeps going and going, you can just look at, not even have read it, and say, okay, this is going to be painful to get through, right? But at the same time, we don't write for US News or USA Today, so we don't want to have these like little one sentence paragraphs where it's all choppy, because then you're not developing an idea. But having a mix of longer and shorter paragraphs, and having a mix, and then within a sentence, having a mix of within a paragraph, a mix of longer and shortened sentences creates a sense of motion. Because if everything's long, it's like, it's hard to wade through lots of long but at the same time, if everything's like these like real simple, short declarative sentences, it's like a machine gun fire. It's like, right? So you want to have this blend that helps us move forward. Another way is to vary word usage. So using synonyms, but do not do this for your constructs. So in academia, different words have very specific meanings tied to them. And so when we're talking about our key theoretical constructs, we don't want to use synonyms. We want to use the same word over and over because it has a specific meaning. But with other words within our paper, look for synonyms, look for ways to vary your word usage, and that will create a sense of motion. Ways to manage pacing. One way is to increase what one author, editor for the New York Times called Frank Flynn, referred to, or Flaherty rather, Francis Flaherty referred to as air words. So phrases like that is, for example, create that little bit of a break or a little bit of a pause within a sentence that allows us to have a little bit of space and then move on. Introducing asides, so the things that we often set off either within hyphens or within parentheses, these can also help manage your motion and pacing, and instead of just blasting through your arguments, give people a chance to step back, because you want folks to be able to have time to think about and absorb what you're telling them, and not just be shooting them in the mouth with a fire hose of information, one right after the other, right? Same thing, don't blast away with only turbo verbs and using lots of excited punctuation. You want to, it's more effective when you use them periodically, right? So they're going to have more effect if they're mixed in with other blander forms. That's going to help us manage the pacing, and that we'll get to that punch when we get the turbo verb. Right branching sentences and paragraphs are another technique that are often used. By right branching, what we mean is the action is loaded at the front, and then the exposition or the explanation, the commentary follows after. So you might have the action in the sentence in the first part, and then the commentary on the action in the rest of the sentence. And paragraphs can be structured the same way. So you have a main point or action at the beginning of the paragraph, and then you comment on and elaborate on it in the following sentences within the paragraph. And so this is another way to manage the flow and the pacing of how of which your information is revealed and the story moves. So at the structural level, we also manage motion and pacing. So I put together this table, and this is also in my book, to think about. These are rules of thumb. So different fields have different rules of thumb. Our journals, in general, these are the typical lengths that we see, excluding abstracts and references and figures and so forth, for the body of a paper. So quantitative paper is typically 40 to 45 pages. Qualitative papers are typically 20 to 30% longer, so we're looking at 45 to 52 pages, and theory papers are typically 30 to 35 pages or shorter. But the amount of space that we allocate to these, I've laid out for the different sections based on the type of paper that you write. But you can see that for a quantitative paper, Freytags Pyramid, the way it's traditionally drawn, is about right. So it's about 10% on the introduction and your exposition, about 35% on your rising action, 35% on your methods and results, so the end of the rising into the falling action, and about 20% on the discussion or denouement. With the qualitative paper, the balance is a little bit different. So we tend to the page length is about the same for an introduction, but it's a shorter part of the overall paper because the paper is longer. And then we have tend to have a shorter front end, a little bit more elaborate methods, but then a much more extensive finding section, and discussions tend to be a bit longer. Theory papers, shorter front end. The body of the paper is really devoted to your theory development, and then a shorter, discussion, but a little bit long, about the same length as we tend to find in quantitative and actually in qualitative papers as well as a percentage. So. But making sure if you spend too much time, if you deviate too much, short or long, from those percentages or from those rules of thumb, you're probably going to have pacing issues, either too fast or too short, right? And so that'll affect your motion as well. Finally, as academics, we have to show as well as tell. We can't just tell people what we're doing. We have to show them and illustrate it. Different techniques. I've already talked about examples, so anecdotes, cases, scenarios. Our figures and tables are other ways of showing, so using images and using our tables to show, but using things like simile and analogy, so like or as, so something is like, my dog has alopecia. She's laying on the floor over here, right here, and so her hair is not regenerating, so her coat is going from black to brown. And one of the veterinary students who saw her said she looks like a cinnamon bear. And so now it's become a nickname for her. So that would be an example of a simile. Metaphor draws the same kinds of relationships between two dissimilar things, but doesn't use the term like or as. So anger washed over the crowd. Anger doesn't literally wash, but wash is a metaphor that we would use for the water flowing over the crowd. That's an example of a metaphor. Allusions are references to well-known stories or examples. So my old colleague from Penn State, Forrest Briscoe, wrote a paper a number of years ago about the Nixon and China effect. And the Nixon and China is an allusion about when Richard Nixon went and met with Mao, and the whole story about why he was able to do that, what the impact of that was. But that's an allusion to a famous story, and the personification is giving human actions, ascribing human actions to non-human characteristics. So finally, last slide, or next to last slide, be conversational. Another way to really enhance your storytelling is to use personal pronouns. Is you're writing it, you're telling it, it's okay to take credit for it. I know that in different cultures, the use of the first person pronouns, I've been told that, we want to feel humble, but it's not being arrogant or aggressive to use personal pronouns. So I use first, I, we, our, your, you in your writing. Give agency to people and organizations, not abstract concepts. Institutional theory doesn't do something. Institutional theorists or scholars do. Use the active voice, and I could do a whole section on that. So those are just some examples of being conversational. So if I'm ready to take questions. I want to let you know that, as you're doing your quiet writing, work on your assignments, but I've also on my website, I've developed a bunch of exercises that go along with topics for today, as well as other topics in my book. And these are out there for folks to use, and they're free to use. There are 12 different exercises currently. If folks come up with other good ones, I take suggestions and will give full credit for others' ideas. If you have a good writing exercise that you would like to suggest, I'm all ears. Just contact me. My book is available right now in hardcover, and Edward Elgar is offering a 40% off discount through the end of the month if you use the POLL40 discount code. I have learned that in order to ship internationally, you have to order from the UK side of their site. So you want to make sure that the price is in pounds, not in dollars. And so there's a slight difference in the web address. So if you live outside the US, make sure you order from the international site and they ship globally. And if you would prefer a more reasonably priced ebook than the institutionally priced hardcover, even with a 40% off discount, the ebook version is available on Google Play and some other sources, but Google Play has the lowest price. It's like $31. So the paperback will be out in July before AOM. So that's it. That's what I have to talk about today. So I've got to find my bar again. There it is. I'll stop my sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Yeah, since it's hard for Tim to follow the questions. So the first question I think most people have is it okay for you to share the slides with our participant today? Because sure. Everyone thinks these are very helpful.
Yeah, I'll email them to Eunice after the talk, and she can share them with everybody. So
thank you very much.
I know it's a lot. Speaking of fire hoses of information, I just pretty much gave that to you guys right now. So.
Yes, but that's a lot of great questions and information here. And I think there's some clarification. One is they want some suggestion on benchmark articles that use some of the great techniques that you mentioned.
Sure. So, I mean, there are lots of them. I would say that, just as a start, anything that Don Hambrick writes, I would look at. he is really good at this. And John Hollenbeck for Micro People, same thing. I think he does a great job with this. I've always been a fan of Kim Elsbach's work, and I think in terms of writing qualitative studies that are interesting and engaging, she always does a really good job. So just as like 3 authors off the top of my head, Barry Staw is another one who's done fantastic and interesting work over the years. Actually, one of my favorite articles is that I think does a really nice job with a lot of these techniques, and I use it as an example in my book, is by Hussein Leblebici. It's Leblebici, Solancic, Kopay, and King. It's their history of the early radio industry and how practices move from the periphery to the core of institutions, and how institutional change occurs. It's a 1991 ASQ. And Leblebici is spelled Leb, L-E-B, I-C-I. So, but that's actually a favorite of mine. I think they did a fantastic job. Jerry Solancic in general is also a really great writer. So anything that he wrote, I mean, he's been gone for a while, but I always refer to his stuff too. He's actually trained as a journalist, and his writing reflects that.
Oh, thank you. And there's a clarification question about what's the difference between showing and telling, and adding a human face.
Sure. So telling is if I provide a theoretical or just an abstract description of how something works, I'm telling you something, right? I'm telling you this is how it works. If I provide an example of, so let's say I'm talking about corporate scandals, right? Or I'm talking about, let's do another one. Let's say I'm talking about CEO narcissism, because this kind of comes to mind. So I can describe how CEO narcissists work and what they do. That narcissists are going to be more likely to kiss up to their board and kick down their employees. But then if I give you an example of Chainsaw Al Dunlap and show you and describe what he actually did and how this illustrates the points that I'm making about how he structured his board, but also disenfranchised them from being involved in the company in ways that led him, at some being that led him to have scandals, and that his employees had ulcers and stomach aches from having to deal with him. If they're gonna hear from him, but that the media loved him because he always made himself available and was always in the news and showing up on CNBC and CNN and so forth. That's there. I'm showing you what I mean when I say a narcissist is going to, seek attention, seek acclaim, but terrorize and kick down and try to dominate others. Okay, does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. And so the human face would be, put the Al Dunlap example, or if I ask you, did you ever have a boss who was terrorized his employees, but was unfailingly groveling and obsequious to those above them? And then that's a rhetorical question, because everybody's thinking about that one person that they worked for that's like, yup, I know exactly what you're talking about, right? That's putting the human face.
Yeah. Okay. And also, they ask, beside reading your book, do you have other suggestions for early scholars who want to learn creative writing method, and kind of practice this? And is there any good workshops, or like what's the way we can start?
So I have 44 writing books on my shelf right up over here. Lots of good ones. I always recommend starting with Stephen King's book on writing. And I also recommend Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird. And there's a book by this guy, Francis Flaherty, called The Elements of Story. And of course, Strunk and White, The Elements of Style, the classic. So reading writing books, but reading widely, reading novels, reading other kinds of reading. One of our challenges as academics is we read so much for our daily lives and jobs, is sometimes we tend not to want to read just for pleasure. But that pleasure reading is really important, because that puts in our ear the sound and the language and the structures of stories. So if you read good fiction, you read interesting, well-written, creative nonfiction, that's going to help you as well. And then it's going to be a matter of practice. So going through and finding good articles, and one of the things I did as a junior faculty member when I was struggling with some of this stuff, I picked 2 articles that I thought were great articles, not necessarily just for the content, but for how they were written. And I went through paragraph by paragraph and just analyzed what they did, how do they structure their arguments, how do they move from one paragraph to the next, and really try to just deconstruct these articles. And you can use, the storytelling structure that I've suggested. You can use some of these, look for these different techniques. In the writing course that I teach for our doctoral students, we do that. I have them read an article, and we'll spend most of a class sometimes just going through and identifying all the different examples of the things that we've talked about, of simile and of metaphor and of allusion, and how they structured these things, emotion and pacing and turbo verbs, and how they use rhythm and repetition and different types of things to manage the rhythm and cadence of their writing, and all these things that I talk about in class. And just doing that and spending time on one article and really picking it apart, and then practicing yourself. The only way you get good at writing is doing it over and over and over again. So, writing and rewriting and practicing, on your own. And one of the reasons I developed some of these exercises was to give people ideas for how to practice some of these different parts and how to think through some of these things. So, encourage you to use those as well. Helen Sword has written a great book too, called Stylish Academic Writing, that I highly recommend. That's another one of my favorites. So, so read about writing, read widely, read for pleasure, and intentionally deconstruct how folks do these things.
Deconstruct, okay. And do these techniques apply to doctoral dissertation?
Yep.
Just as.
Absolutely. because dissertations are really long. And so you really need to think about, your committee members trudging through your 200, 250 pages of dissertation, and you want to keep them moving along, right? So the motion and pacing in particular and making it engaging is really critical. And thinking about how do I structure and how do I manage these things, is I think particularly critical in a good dissertation. And because you're going to be taking your dissertations and turning them into journal articles, that's also a big part of, of what you're going to want to lay this all out there, because you're going to have to pare them down and focus them and turn them into journal articles eventually as well. So.
And I guess I know we have very limited time. There's another very interesting question is that, would you be able to give an example of how would you use some of these techniques to do a literature review? To make it more story-like.
So in thinking about the literature review, so part of what you're doing in a literature review is you're elaborating on your introduction, right? So the introduction, the introduction should have almost a miniature literature review in it. You're setting up, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's why what we don't know is important, right? And then your study is going to answer what we're going to learn. But the literature review is part of that exposition that kind of sets up the world as it is, but has problems. So what you want to be able to do is say, here's what we know, but here's an issue with that, right? So you're going to have to think about and strategically pick articles that are going to help elaborate and illustrate the points that you want to make, but then also say, but here's what we don't know about this. And the things that you say we don't know better be the things that you answer, right? Because you don't want to set up a bunch of problems that you don't answer yourself in your study. So if you're not going to answer that question, don't talk about it in the literature review. So you don't want to list every problem ever found. What you're doing is setting up your story. So you're laying that groundwork for the tensions, for the conflict that you're going to be going to be resolving. So as you pick your examples and you think about what literatures to review, really focus on, okay, how's this going to help me tell my story? How's this going to set up the challenges that I face, but also provide the backstory for my character so people know who they are, how they work, what we know about them to date, so we can see how they're going to change over the course of the story. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's most of the questions we have. There were some new questions coming up as we were chatting, and
Sure.
about, there's a kind of a dilemma for doctoral students trying to follow the tradition and the guidelines versus and be more creative and telling story, and how do we strike the balance between following the tradition versus and telling a good story and be creative.
Yeah. So the traditions. So first, it's where you're creative, right? So one of the things that if you talk to people in advertising, creatives in advertising, they'll say that the creative part of being in advertising is not coming up with something completely new and different, having just a blank sheet. What they want to do is have a structure, and then it's working within that structure. So you think about a haiku. It's 3 lines, 575 syllables about nature, very constrained structure. But you can be endlessly creative in the haikus that you write. And thinking about an academic article the same way. So where you're not looking to be creative is in the overall structure of the article. The introduction, how you lay out the major parts of the article with the introduction, hypothesis development, or theoretical background findings, depending on what you're doing. But it's within that, right? How do you tell the story in a way that's interesting and creative, but that people can still follow? And so, like I said, things that are, the conventions, that some of these conventions are really horrible. People who have told folks, oh, you shouldn't use personal pronouns in articles is completely wrong. That it has to be boring to be rigorous. Not true, right? You can be rigorous and very interesting. Like I said, the people that I've listed as some of the scholars you can look at, all super rigorous scholars, all really interesting storytellers. Right. So it's not like, oh, they can do that because they're so-and-so. They're so-and-so because they do that. Right. They've always been telling stories that way. So you become, famous and successful by doing these things. It's not like you wait until you're famous and successful and then you have license to do it and you write boring stuff that's, poorly structured, up until then. Right.
Yeah.
So so that's so I'd say don't, have a little confidence, and, you're always going to run into people who are going to bitch about some of these things. You know, ignore them and move on, right? So, but the key is to be, you know, if you're theoretically rigorous and grounded and explaining things and doing all this stuff well, these things actually fade into the background. You know, a really good writer, you don't notice how good the writing is, right? You're not going, oh wow, that's such a well-crafted sentence. And, oh wow, you're in the story, you're following it, right? And so the really good writers, this stuff kind of fades in the background, so you're less likely to get challenged on it because it's working.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we have here. Thank you so much for the great sharing and questions and answers.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. So I'm happy to do it. Thanks for having me. So Eunice, are you going to do your poll now, or are you just going to let me know later?
Sure. So thank you so much, Vivian, for facilitating the Q&A session. And I'm going to launch a quick poll because I got so many emails asking about whether this is going to be recorded. Is there going to be another session? So we've decided to host another one with Tim in April. And this time we want to gather your feedback in terms of which topic you want him to cover. So please answer this poll. This will show up. And we'll try to cater as much to what you're interested in.
I'm typing some of these book names into the chat right now.
Oh, actually, Charlene was able to share some of the titles. So.
Oh, she did? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So. I saw a comment about that. So okay. So there's two of them.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be closing the poll pretty soon. Okay, and another thing I want to do before you go, if you're not staying for the second half, is to take a group photo, the STR tradition. So if you're there and if you are okay with sharing your videos, I would appreciate it if you could quickly turn it on. And in terms of the poll, I think we are almost tied between the theory and hypothesis section and the discussion section. So Tim and Vivian and I will try to see which one we want to do. So yeah, you can see theory and hypothesis is getting the most votes. Here are the results.
All right.
Okay, so yeah, if you are available, please turn on your camera or your video for a quick moment. And 1, 2, 3, and smile. There you go. Thank you so much for participating today. And for those of you who are staying for the second half for your quiet writing time, please stay online and we'll take a quick break and come back for that. If you're not, thank you again for joining, and thank you so much, Tim, for this wonderful presentation and such a helpful information for everyone here who are writers.
Well, it's my pleasure. I've really enjoyed it, and so thanks to everybody who's gotten up super early like Eunice or stayed up super late, depending on where you are in the world. And I hope I'll see you all again, I guess, in April. So I'll see you later. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. See ya.